It was a summer night in Houston. Hot, the way August always is in Texas. Thick air, city lights bleeding into a dark sky. Two young people had been out dancing. They had laughed, they had moved, they had been alive. When the night wound down, they drove to a quiet spot on the west side of the city. A cul-de-sac at the edge of nothing, trees pressing in close. The kind of place where the noise of the city fades and the world feels like just the two of you. They were never seen alive again. For 36 years, the names Cheryl Henry and Garland Andy Atkinson were whispered in Houston like a wound that refused to close. A case that investigators worked relentlessly, hundreds of leads, every dead and a fresh loss. A case that haunted two families through decades of silence, grief, and desperate hope that never fully died. Then, in March of 2026, a DNA match fired in a federal database. An FBI SWAT team crossed state lines. A 64-year-old man was arrested in a Nebraska apartment. Justice had finally arrived, but it did not stay. 2 days before he was due to be extradited to Texas to stand trial, the suspect was found unresponsive in his jail cell. The charge was dismissed. He would never sit in a courtroom. He would never look the families in the eye. He would never answer for what happened on that summer night in 1990. This is the story of two lives cut short, of a crime that refused to stay buried, and of what happens when justice arrives 36 years late and then slips away at the very last second. Cheryl Henry was 22 years old. She was bright and loving, the kind of person her family could not imagine the world without. She was close to her father, Robert, and to her sister Shane. They moved through their days with the easy warmth of a tight family. Cheryl had a life ahead of her. Plans. People who loved her completely. Garland Atkinson, everyone called him Andy, was 21. He and his cousin Tim Godwin were more than family. They were brothers in every way that mattered. The kind of bond where you would do anything for the other person without a second thought. By the summer of 1990, Cheryl and Andy had found each other. They were young and in love in a city that felt full of possibility. On the evening of August 22, 1990, they went out to a Houston nightclub with Cheryl's sister. It was a good night. But as the hours passed, her sister headed home. Cheryl and Andy stayed on. At some point, they drove to a secluded dead end on Enclave Parkway, a quiet cul-de-sac surrounded by undeveloped land on the west side of the city. A lover's lane, somewhere to be alone. When Cheryl did not show up for work the following morning, her family called the police. That phone call was the beginning of 36 years of waiting. Tim Godwin held on to optimism at first. He told himself this would be solved in 3 to 6 months. Justice would come. That was how things were supposed to work. He had no way of knowing he would still be waiting as a middle-aged man. That two sets of parents would grow old and die without ever seeing the person responsible face a courtroom. It was a security guard on routine patrol who found the white Honda Civic first. It sat at the end of that cul-de-sac, completely still, sometime on the morning of August 23rd. It had been there for hours. Something about it felt wrong. The guard approached. On the passenger side floor, he saw a purse. Inside it, Cheryl Henry's identification. There was an unresponsive figure inside the vehicle. He called police immediately. When Houston police officers arrived, the scene told the story of a violent struggle. The driver's seat was fully reclined. The rubber floor mat had been shoved out of place. There was blood on the inside of the driver's door, near the handle. The key was still in the ignition. Nobody inside. They expanded their search into the surrounding woods. In a wooded area near the car, officers found Cheryl's body. She had been hidden beneath wooden boards, placed there deliberately. She had been sexually assaulted. Her throat had been slashed. A $20 bill had been left beside her. A detail so cold, so deliberate, that investigators would never forget it. Andy Atkinson was found approximately 200 yards away. He had been bound and tied to a tree. His throat had been cut with such violence that one news report described him as nearly decapitated. Investigators believe the killer restrained Andy first, kept him alive, made him listen. Andy's father, Garland Atkinson Sr., would carry that knowledge for the rest of his life. He spoke about it years later, and every word carried the full weight of 3 decades of grief. He was tied to a tree, he said, and listened to her scream, listened to her being murdered, knowing they were going to do the same thing to him, and he couldn't do anything about it. There are no words adequate to that image. There never will be. From the beginning, investigators knew they were dealing with a predatory stranger attack. That made it harder. There were no obvious connections to the victims, no clear motives, no immediate suspects. But they had something crucial: DNA recovered during Cheryl Henry's autopsy, a biological profile of the killer, preserved and waiting. In 1990, DNA forensics was still in its infancy. The National Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, did not become fully operational until 1998. So investigators kept the evidence, kept working, kept hoping that one day, science would catch up to what they needed. Months became years. Years became decades. In 2008, they got a partial breakthrough. The DNA from the crime scene was linked to a separate rape case in the database, confirming the killer had struck before. But the profile still had no name attached to it. They had the ghost of a man, not the man himself. What no one knew, what investigators had no way of knowing, was that their suspect had been walking in and out of Harris County courtrooms for years. Floyd William Parrott had been convicted of impersonating a peace officer in 1988. He had done it again in 1990. And just 1 week after Cheryl and Andy's bodies were found, 1 week, he stood in a Harris County courtroom and pled guilty to impersonating an officer. He was sentenced to 2 years. The investigators working the Lovers Lane murders were, in all probability, in the same building. They had no idea the man being processed down the hall had been living less than a mile from the murder scene at the time of the killings. He served his time. He came back. He was convicted again in 1996, 20 years that time. He served 3, paroled in 1999, and then he simply drifted away. For decades, Floyd Parrott moved through life as though nothing had happened. He owned property in New Connie, Texas, east of Houston, until around 2020. Then he moved north. By the time investigators came looking for him, he was living alone in an apartment in Lincoln, Nebraska. He was 64 years old. The break came in late 2025. A tip reached investigators, a name: Floyd William Parrott. A homicide sergeant began pulling on the thread. A 1996 police report surfaced. A sexual assault case in which Parrott had been the accused. He claimed the encounter was consensual. The case was no billed by a grand jury. But DNA had been collected from that investigation, and that DNA had recently been uploaded to CODIS. When the system ran its comparison, it returned a hit. A case-to-case match between the male DNA profile from the 1996 case, in which Parrott himself was the named suspect, and the DNA recovered from Cheryl Henry's sexual assault examination at her autopsy 30 years earlier. It was him. A second match confirmed it. A sexual assault and robbery in northwest Houston from June of 1990, committed just weeks before the Lovers Lane murders, also matched his profile. On March 25, 2026, an FBI SWAT team surrounded an apartment complex in Lincoln, Nebraska. They took Floyd William Parrott into custody. He was charged with capital murder. When investigators confronted him, he told them he had never met Cheryl Henry. The following day, District Attorney Chantier stood before the cameras. One of Houston's most haunting and infamous cold cases, he said, has weighed on the Henry and Atkinson families for more than 3 decades. They never gave up on Cheryl and Andy. For the first time in 36 years, it seemed like justice was finally within reach. It wasn't. The families wept. They released a statement. They called it bittersweet, because they were grateful, deeply grateful, And at the same time, there were two people who had waited the longest who were no longer there to receive the news. Robert Henry, Cheryl's father, had spent decades holding on to hope. He had spoken publicly about the case. He had asked anyone who knew anything to come forward. He had never stopped looking for answers. He passed away in 2024. Garland Atkinson Sr., Andy's father, the man who had carried that unbearable image of his son tied to a tree, had also died in 2024. Just months before the tip came in. Just months before the name was finally spoken out loud for the first time. Cheryl's sister Shane put it simply, "It's heartbreaking that they don't get to have this day." And then it got worse. On April 28, 2026, 1 month after the arrest, 2 days before Parrott was scheduled to be extradited to Texas, he was found unresponsive in his cell at the Lancaster County Adult Detention Facility in Lincoln, Nebraska. It was 7:23 in the morning. Jail staff performed CPR. He was declared dead in his cell. Authorities believe he took his own life. His capital murder charge was dismissed. There would be no trial, no testimony, no verdict. The prosecution had been building toward the death penalty. Under Texas law, given the age of the offense, a conviction might not even have resulted in prison time. The families had endured 36 years of silence, then 1 month of fragile hope, and now this. Parrott had made one final choice. He had made it on his own terms, the same way he had lived for 36 years, without consequence, without accountability, without ever having to face what he had done. There is a particular cruelty in how this case ended, not in how it began, because crimes like this always carry cruelty, but in the mathematics of it. 36 years of waiting. A DNA match that came only because someone uploaded old evidence into a database at exactly the right time. An FBI team crossing state lines to arrest a man who had been living freely while 2 families grieved around the absence he had created. And then, nothing. No trial. No confession. No moment where the families could look across a courtroom at the man who took everything from them. Parrott denied them that. Just as he had denied them for 36 years, he denied them again at the very end. Shane Craig, Cheryl's sister, said that despite everything, she believed her mother and Andy's father were watching. "We know they're with them," she said, "and rejoicing in their own ways." That kind of grace, under that kind of weight, is extraordinary. The families of Cheryl Henry and Andy Atkinson have carried themselves with a dignity this case never deserved to ask of them. What this case leaves behind is a lesson about cold case forensics, about what modern DNA science can uncover even 3.5 decades later, about the importance of preserving evidence and uploading it fully, about the tips that change everything when they finally come, and about the investigators who kept going when every lead ran dry, because some cases are too important to abandon. Cheryl Henry was 22 years old. Andy Atkinson was 21. They went dancing on an August night in Houston. They deserved to come home. If you want to keep uncovering the cases that history forgot, subscribe and join the investigation. Cheryl, Andy, we haven't forgotten.